Nothing happens in a vacuum, people, and this is all messed up. And I would like to mention that during my research, I also discovered that Dr. Seuss was a racist. Alright, okay, alright. Okay, alright. Hi there, my name's Leija. I'm a real-life lawyer and I'm on a mission to demystify the law and how it affects your everyday life. This is a Get Ready With Me video where I'm going to explain to you an important Supreme Court case that I think you should understand. As always, I'd like to remind you that nothing I'm doing here is meant to make light of the case. A lot of these iconic Supreme Court cases can have really heavy subject material, and I am not doing it while also putting on my makeup as a means of making light of the case. I am simply doing it as a means of making it accessible to people, because I love Get Ready With Me videos, and I love it when the people who make them also talk about useful or interesting information while they're doing it. It's like 1-2 punch. It's like 2 birds, 1 stone, you know? And that's what I'm here for. And I think the law is really inaccessible, and I want to make it accessible to you. And that's why I want to tell you about important Supreme Court cases, like today's case, Korematsu versus the United States of America. 2 disclaimers before we get started. I am not a makeup artist, so be nice to me, but I am a lawyer. But I'm not your lawyer. Nothing that I say here should be construed as legal advice. Please seek the help of a licensed attorney if you have any legal questions. Alright, like I said, today I want to talk to you about Korematsu versus the United States. Before I get started, I do want to give a little content warning. There's a lot of racism going on in this case, so specifically against Japanese Americans, but just generally, you've been warned. Korematsu versus the United States is a 1944 Supreme Court case that upheld the use of exclusion zones on the West Coast during World War II. The use of exclusion zones during World War II was a method that the United States government used as a means of forcibly removing 120,000 Japanese Americans from their homes. And this court case said that that was fine. It basically condoned the use of internment camps, that's right, basically concentration camps, on US soil. This is a 1944 case. Why am I bringing it up now? Because it's still important. First, it's always important to know the history of racial bigotry in your country so that you can hopefully not repeat it again. And second, because this racial bigotry against Asians is still playing out today. If you look at the hysteria over the China flu or Trump's travel ban, it's still very much woven into the fabric of the United States society. It's also important to know this history so that you can put tweets from the President of the United States like this, and like this one, into context. Nothing happens in a vacuum, people, and this is all messed up. Alright, let's jump into the background of Korematsu versus the United States. Actually, before we get started, I would like to ask you to please give a thumbs up to this video if you find it interesting or entertaining, and please subscribe if you want to hear more from me. Let's get into it, shall we? Oh, God. Alright, so to understand this, we have to go back to World War II. Specifically, I'd like to go back to December 7th, 1941, which is the day that the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor in the Hawaii territory of the United States. This was kind of the beginning of well, no, let's stop there. It's not the beginning. It was a culmination of decades of tension that had been growing in that hemisphere, in that area between the United States and Japan. At this point, about 120,000 Japanese Americans were living on the west coast of the United States. After Pearl Harbor, the media played a large role in hyping up the hysteria around Japanese Americans. There was a lot of questions around whether or not Japanese Americans could ever possibly be loyal to the United States, and whether they were spying in US borders. This hysteria included Japanese Americans who were born here and who were United States citizens. And I would like to mention that during my research, I also discovered that Dr. Seuss was a racist. It ruined everything. So due to this hysteria that was largely fomented in the United States by the media, there was this growing fear that the Japanese were going to attack on the west coast of the United States. Again, there's 120,000 people of Japanese ancestry living on the west coast of the United States at that time, so people made the connection that if people are from Japan or have Japanese ancestry, then they're gonna spy and they can't be trusted. Oh, that's a lot. I got too much on my fingers. That's probably fine, right? Alright, okay, alright. Okay, alright. So this hysteria grew to the point that Congress began an investigation into the question of whether there was espionage happening amongst the Japanese community in the United States. And as part of that investigation, they had a guy named Lieutenant General John Dewitt come before Congress and testify. And that John Dewitt character would go on to be the guy that headed up the internment camp program in the United States. And at those congressional hearings, he testified, and I quote, "I don't want any people of Japanese ancestry here. They are a dangerous element. There is no way to determine their loyalty. It makes no difference whether he is an American citizen, he is still a Japanese. American citizenship does not necessarily determine loyalty, but we must worry about the Japanese all the time until he is wiped off the map." Like, this was a guy with quite a bit of military power at the time who was saying just openly racist things in front of Congress, and Congress was like, sick. Let's put him in charge. So after this hearing before Congress, there were a number of presidential orders that were issued that allowed the government on the West Coast to require that people of Italian, German, and Japanese ancestry carry ID on them at all time, and they also instigated a curfew for Italian, German, and Japanese people living on the West Coast. But the presidential order at issue in the Korematsu case was Presidential Order number 9066, which allowed for the creation of exclusion zones wherever the military saw fit, basically. The presidential order said, and I quote, "I hereby authorize and direct the Secretary of War and the military commanders whom he may from time to time designate to prescribe military areas in such places and of such extent as he or the appropriate military commander may determine, from which any or all persons may be excluded, and with respect to which the right of any person to enter, remain in, or leave shall be subject to whatever restrictions the Secretary of War or the appropriate military commander may impose in his discretion." So again, it gave huge amounts of discretion to the military to create these exclusion zones, which was like a fancy, kind way of saying that you can basically forcibly remove whoever you want. And it was a veiled way of saying get the Japanese off the West Coast. Of course, the order didn't specifically say Japanese, however, the way that it was applied was against Japanese citizens mostly, and not against Italians and Germans. Again, a lot of the orders were targeting Italians, Germans, and Japanese because those were the people with whom we were at war, but this order was really only ever applied to Japanese Americans. So under these orders, Dewitt and all of the other military commanders that he worked with and who worked under him went around the west coast of the United States and began relocating Japanese American, mostly citizens. About 60% of the Japanese Americans who were relocated were United States citizens. Oh my god, okay, I had to take a fan break. I'm sweating. Okay, where was I? So these exclusion zones allowed for General Dewitt to forcibly remove mostly people of Japanese ancestry, mostly from the western coast of the United States, and they were moved inland into internment camps where they were kept for the duration of the war. So around this time, there's this guy named Fred Korematsu. He's a 23-year-old native of California who happens to be of Japanese ancestry. He tried to enlist in the Coast Guard and the National Guard, and they told him that he couldn't because he was Japanese. So he became a welder and a foreman at a shipyard. And when these orders came down that everyone of Japanese ancestry had to evacuate, he did not follow the orders and instead decided to stay behind with his white girlfriend at the time, who encouraged him to go see a plastic surgeon to get his eyes changed so that the surgeon could put folds in his eyes so that he would look less of Japanese ancestry. And he also changed his name so that it sounded more Latino. By 1942, however, he ended up getting arrested because the government had collected quite a bit of information on Japanese Americans living on the coast anyway, so they kind of knew who people were, and also he was turned in by someone who recognized him. While he was in jail, a lawyer from the ACLU, that's the American Civil Liberties Union, visited him and asked him if he would be willing to be part of their case that they were mounting against the United States government for the internment of Japanese Americans. Like I mentioned in my Roe v. Wade Get Ready With Me video, there's such thing as cause lawyering, which is when lawyers pick a cause that they want to try to change using the court system, and then they find test cases to bring to courts to see if they can change the laws via judicial decisions. And this lawyer from the ACLU was one such cause lawyer, and he wanted to see if Fred Korematsu would be willing to be a part of the case that he was mounting against the United States government for the internment of Japanese Americans. And Fred agreed to do it. So Fred was convicted of defying the orders, and he was sentenced to 5 years probation and was expelled with his family to a internment camp in Utah. Again, imagine being born in Oakland, raised in Oakland, and feel very American, and then be forced to move to Utah. And that conviction that he got, where he was sentenced to 5 years probation, he appealed it, and it eventually ended up in the United States Supreme Court in 1944. Alright, so what was Fred's argument? So Fred's argument was that the order and his subsequent prosecution under it was a violation of his Fifth Amendment due process rights. But what even is the Fifth Amendment? You hear people pleading the Fifth when they're in court, but that's not all that the Fifth Amendment does, and I wanted to take a moment to go in a little bit deeper into what the Fifth Amendment actually does. So here's the full text of the Fifth Amendment, and I've broken it down into 5 parts. This is verbatim, word for word, what the Fifth Amendment says, but I found that dividing it into 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 actually helps to delineate different parts, because again, it was written during the 1700s, and so the writing is a little bit unclear, and that's why we've spent the better part of the past 200 years trying to decipher what the hell they meant. So the Fifth Amendment says, 1. No person shall be held to answer for a capital or otherwise infamous crime, unless on a presentment or indictment of a grand jury, except in cases arising in the land or naval forces or in the militia when in actual service in time of war or public danger. Alright, so that says a lot, but basically what it means is that a prosecutor has to go before a grand jury in order to secure a criminal indictment against someone on the federal level. 2. Nor shall any person be subject for the same offense to be twice put in jeopardy of life or limb. That's the double jeopardy clause, which means that you can't be tried twice for the same crime. 3. Nor shall be compelled in any criminal case to be a witness against himself. That's what people are referring to when they say, I plead the Fifth. It means that you don't have to ever say anything self-incriminating in a criminal case. 4. Nor be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. That means that if you are deprived of life, liberty, or property, that you are due a certain amount of process from the government, usually notice and a hearing. This is the part of the Fifth Amendment that Fred is referring to in his defense. And then 5, nor shall private property be taken for public use without just compensation. This is considered the takings clause. I mentioned it in my TikTok video. Basically, the government cannot take your property without just compensation in most cases. So again, Fred used that part 4 of the Fifth Amendment breakdown that I just gave you, saying that his due process rights were violated because he was not given notice and a hearing. Basically, the due process clause of the Fifth Amendment requires that you get your day in court. The opinion of the United States Supreme Court was authored by Justice Hugo Black, who was an FDR appointee and who is revered as one of the more influential justices of the 20th century in the US Supreme Court. He was also a former KKK member. This is your friendly reminder to always question the people that history has so long revered. Now, the opinion did recognize that when a law discriminates against a group of people based on their race, it should be given the highest scrutiny. This is now known as strict scrutiny, and it means the government has to show that the racially discriminatory law was necessary to achieve a compelling government interest. At the time in 1944, when this opinion was written, strict scrutiny wasn't quite as developed, so it was really notable that the Supreme Court recognized that when a law discriminates against a certain race of people, that it should be given the highest level of scrutiny by courts. However, then Justice Blackmun goes on and says, well, even under the highest level of scrutiny, this discrimination is fine due to military necessity. Basically, the level of deference that should be given to the military during times of war, as well as the extreme threat from the outside, fully justified the discrimination against all Japanese people in the United States. Now, while the majority of the court held that this was justified, it's not like there weren't people at the time who could clearly see that this was racial discrimination and bigotry and nothing more. The Supreme Court's dissent noted that it was clearly racist because of the lenient treatment for Germans and Italians under the laws, and noted that deference to the military in times of war didn't mean that they just got a blank check to do whatever they wanted regardless of the Constitution, and that this decision could set a dangerous precedent going forward. This justification, according to the dissent, was insufficient and overbroad because you can't just say that all Japanese Americans are potentially disloyal to the United States and then put them all in camps. So Fred lost the case at the Supreme Court level and spent the rest of the war in an internment camp with his family. After the war, he moved to Detroit, where he met his future wife, Catherine, and then they ended up moving back to California in the late 40s and had 2 children. And Fred struggled throughout his life because of this conviction, because obviously when you have a conviction, then it's harder to get employment and it's basically a mar on your record. Then in the 1980s, some lawyers and scholars did some digging in the National Archives and accidentally came across some reports that were made at the time of the Korematsu decision and during the time of the Japanese internment camps that were made by the government that explicitly said that there was no actual military necessity of the creation of these internment camps. These documents were suppressed during Korematsu's trial and hearing before the Supreme Court, and they would have been very helpful to his case because the whole case was decided based on the military necessity of the discrimination against Japanese Americans. Based on this government misconduct, Fred Korematsu's case was reopened and his conviction was overturned in a California district court. However, because this court is lower than the Supreme Court, the case Korematsu versus the United States decided before the Supreme Court was good law still, because a lower court can't overturn Supreme Court precedent. This case was overturned based on different issues because of government misconduct, but the decision that the Supreme Court reached, that the military necessity was valid for the creation of this discriminatory law, was still good law at the Supreme Court level, because only the Supreme Court can overturn the Supreme Court. In 1988, Reagan signed the Civil Liberties Act of 1988, which formally recognized that the United States messed up when it created those internment camps. You'll realize that 1988 is many, many decades after the creation of these internment camps, and it took that long for the US to formally recognize that it was wrong, but it did with that act. And as part of that act, it paid all living people who had been interned in those camps $20,000, which in today's money is around $50,000, so like a year's salary for the average person, in exchange for the usually around 3 years that they spent basically in prison. In 1988, Fred was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom by President Bill Clinton for his service, I guess, to the United States for the wrong that was done to him. Again, the Supreme Court case, though, was still good law at this point. Alright, here we go. So it wasn't until 2018, 74 years later, that the Korematsu decision was finally overturned in the United States Supreme Court in a case called Trump versus Hawaii. This is ironic, at least I think it's ironic. Alanis Morissette kind of ruined my understanding of the word ironic, because I know that the way she uses it is wrong, but now I can't figure out exactly if I'm ever using it right, and I'm really paranoid that I'm not. But I think in this case, ironic is the correct word. This is ironic given the fact that Trump versus Hawaii was the Supreme Court decision that upheld Trump's travel ban. So basically they said, well, this travel ban's fine, but while we're on the subject, Korematsu, not so great. See, we're not racists. The court just took the opportunity to put a sentence or two in saying that Korematsu was gravely wrong the day it was decided, has been overruled in the court of history, and to be clear, has no place in law under the Constitution. Also adding that the forcible relocation of US citizens to concentration camps solely and explicitly on the basis of race is objectively unlawful and outside the scope of presidential authority. So 2018 is when the Korematsu decision was finally overturned. However, again, it was in a case that was upholding the travel ban, which banned people from majority Muslim countries from entering the United States, on the same notion that, well, we can't trust any of them. In fact, Goddess and Justice Sonia Sotomayor stated in her dissent in Trump versus Hawaii that the majority decision redeploys the same dangerous logic underlying Korematsu and merely replaces one gravely wrong decision with another. Amen, Justice Sotomayor. This is all the more evidence that history is just one big circle and we haven't seemed to learn anything from it. If you'd like to learn more about the Korematsu decision and the story behind Korematsu versus the United States, I highly recommend, there's a podcast called More Perfect. It's from Radiolab, and it's amazing, and it covers the Supreme Court and the Constitution, and I highly recommend just generally if you are interested in those subjects. But the American Pendulum 1 episode is about the Korematsu decision, and it has archived interviews with Fred Korematsu, and it's just amazingly done and will give you even more background into this story. I'll throw a link to it down below. Thank you so much for joining me on this Get Ready With Me video. I am happy that I got to discuss this very important case. Please comment down below if you have any other cases that you're curious about and you'd like me to do a video on. Also, give this video a thumbs up if you found it interesting or entertaining, and subscribe if you want to see more from me. Thanks so much. Bye!